With apologies to my Latin American friends, I'm going to speak English. The problem is a bit too difficult to deal with it at my level of Spanish, so I'll do it in English. I would like to salute all the colleagues here, whether they be representatives of international organizations, national organizations, or simply like me, academics and trying to do their best in research. I want to really tell you how honored I am to have the opportunity of speaking to all of you today. I want to thank most particularly Eduardo Aguado and of course Ariana Becerril for their really kind and wonderful invitation and the way they did it too, because if we went through the petite histoire of the invitation, you would know how graceful and wonderful they were. So I want to mark this. The title of this little presentation adds a little winky note to the general theme by making an allusion to a Spanish television series which has been going on American television recently on PBS, and which I've been watching with great glee. It is about Spain in the 20s with a very progressive young woman who tries to change the education of young women in Spain. It's quite funny to watch. So let me get going with this presentation. This is the oldest printed book with printed wood blocks. It's called the Diamond Sutra, and it's in the English Library in London. I wanted to show it to you, first of all, because my very good friend and Diamond publishing supporter in France, Marie Farge, called me up 2 days ago to tell me you should talk about this. And I said, well, I think it's a very good idea. And then she explained to me why I should talk about this, not because it's just an old book, but also because at the end of the book, the person who put it together just said, reverently made for universal free distribution. So you see that right in the 9th century of our common era already in China, there was a demand to do some open access and perhaps even diamond open access without any internet or digitization. But to go on a more serious note, I also want to quote Reggie Raju's statement in an article in which he was expressing his frustrations. He sensed that after 20 years of open access, there was a sense of betrayal. Process had replaced purpose. And I think this is going to be an important point of my talk today, and see how diamond open access can perhaps push us in the right direction and correct these kinds of problems. So we have two main questions that we should try to respond to in reaction to the sense of frustration and even betrayal. Why should we privilege a diamond option? And eventually, what form should it take? Because, you know, open access in 2001 and in BOAI, the BOAI issue in February 2002, open access seemed to be the magic bullet. We can do it. And then we found that it could be really used in very strange ways by some of the actors involved in this ecosystem, as the word goes nowadays. So let me start with a very, very clear and strong thesis. As far as I'm concerned, this is my own personal voice. No solution other than diamond open access can make open access fair to all, and I mean all in terms of readers, all in terms of authors, all in any country in the world, all in academia or not in academia. This is very important for all to have a diamond access. It's fair to the readers, and it's fair to the researcher as author. And in passing, I don't think you solve the problem by saying, well, we don't insist that authors pay personally. Maybe somebody else can pay the fees of publication. That doesn't change much of anything, because people who cannot pay for their publication generally are in places where the institutions cannot pay for the publication. So it's just a way of hiding behind a false tree. So what happened, because we need context too. My friend Pierre Mounier was telling me yesterday, it's a good thing that you're going to try and complexify things a little bit. Don't simplify too much. I am taking his words too hard. What happened to create the present problems? Well, first came really the economics of scientific publishing. But, you know, when you talk about the economics of scientific publishing, people always, I did the same. They always say, well, you know, journals have been around since 1665. Oldenburg's Long Shadow, you remember that strange paper by that weird guy from Montreal? You have a illusion that the publishing of science has always been done in the same way. It's completely false. The present economic system of scientific publishing really began to take its shape in 1950-55 and began to be really active, dominant perhaps even in the 1970s. It's a 50-year-old story at most. So don't tell me that we've always had the kind of system that we do now. And beside that, the second thing I'm going to talk about in this talk is, of course, the importance of the internet and digitization, network computers. The two processes now are, of course, deeply entangled. So, in the 70s, you could read what Eileen Fife, the historian from Scotland, wrote. Journal publishers who were willing to look to an international English-speaking market rather than a national one, and to focus their efforts on institutions rather than individuals, namely libraries, of course, discovered that it was possible to make journal publishing commercially successful in a way that had been unimaginable 50 years earlier. This quote comes from last year, by the way. And in what she calls a national market, a bit by enthusiasm in the term, really is nothing more in her analysis than a national audience. Before 1960s, most journals were largely indifferent to markets. There were no journal markets to speak of. What they did was seeking various forms of subsidies to maintain themselves, to obtain what we call now grandly sustainability. They were just doing that sort of work with their societies, the dues, government help, and other donors that wanted to support that kind of cause. Now, a market, and this is where the key of my presentation lies, a market is created if you have rules on which you can rest a certain form of competition. In this case, after the 50s, suddenly the journals became a merchandise. We're going to try and sell issues of journals, just as if you were selling a popular magazine or a novel or a cookbook. And because of that, the journals had to be changed. They had to be adapted to this new competition. In fact, instead of being instruments of a community, the voice of a community, reflecting certain interests, certain concerns, certain ways of doing science, whatever, they became essentially instruments of prestige. They became a brand. It's when the same thing happened to a scarf when it becomes a Hermes scarf. A Hermes scarf is not meant to be a scarf. It's meant to say, see how sharp I am and wealthy I am, see what a great person I am. Journals became modified to do that. And that's the trick that took place in the midst of the 20th century. And to do that, an algorithm was, at that point, taken up by some publishers. It was the management of what I call citation chasing through the impact factor, the horrible impact factor that we all know about and which we have to get really, we have to really deal with. Thank you. Okay. On top of that, when your scarf becomes a Hermes scarf, you affect the production of scarves. Well, likewise, when you do this sort of treatment to publications by having people completely obsessing about citations through the algorithm of the impact factor, you end up distorting the process of knowledge production. For one thing, the incentives change. And I have heard here, in fact, some horrible stories of people making application of grants and having to fill columns saying how many citations they had from journals that had been put in a certain list and all that. Where are we? Very frankly, where are we? And the steep rises in prices that are made possible by this new way of treating journals like a merchandise creates deeper inequalities into the whole system of scientific research. Inside countries, poorer institutions become relatively poorer. Between countries, poorer countries become relatively poorer. And you end up with a situation which is not unsimilar to what is happening right now in the financial world. A small minority is making a lot of money on their investments while everybody is fighting to keep their money at some basic level and quite often not succeeding. All happen within countries, between countries, all over the world. We all know that citation bias exists, and it's quite well documented. I gave one citation. If I'd had 5 hours, I would have given you 100. The impact factor of the original publishing journal, not the methodology or quality of the research, was the strongest predictor of citations per year. Where does that come from? The Journal of the American Medical Association. It's not from some marginal person way out in the boondocks. No, there is a problem with this citation chasing, with the algorithm, and very clearly the impact factor. Now, in a sense, the market philosophy is perfectly opposed to the Redalyc slogan. I'd put it back in Spanish: the science that is not seen in a prestigious journal does not exist. So that's what we're at. We're in a world in which if you want to have grants, if you want to have the upper promotions worldwide, if you want to play a real role in science, if you want to be part of the elite of science, you'd better publish in prestigious journals. Not because your work is good, but because it's going to be cited. No, we're in complete nonsense. When you consider the number of intelligent people that work in science who manage to accept and be subjected to a rule as ridiculous as that, you just pinch yourself and you say, in what world have I fallen? Science fiction can do better. Of course, a prestigious journal, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you, is a journal with a high IF, impact factor. And then I could go do my usual riffs about the ridiculousness of, until recently, the three decimals of the impact factor, and so on and so forth. So the market commercialization of scientific journal has also had another important effect. It has deeply intensified competition, and not just between researchers at the individual level, but at all levels. I was talking to someone from Mexico back in Chiapas years ago, and I was talking about the funding agencies because I was saying they're not assessed, so they have more freedom to speak and to do than anybody else in this kind of system. And he said, yes, but they have to report to their ministry, and the ministries are interested in the question of country rankings. So we end up with having, again, a problem of, you might say, Russian dolls inside each other, which all support the whole pyramid, so that at the center remains the journal as merchandise and the type of competition that status of journals demands for them. So rankings dominate at all levels, from individuals to all countries. And in a sense, science has become a football league. You look at the matches and you see the points and how many goals they have and so on and so forth. So the emergence, on the other hand, of open access was dictated by the diffusion of the internet. The impulse to have open access has always been in science. Exchange systems in medical libraries were trying to survive with printed materials. You had, for example, the practice of giving off-prints to authors so that they could distribute their papers freely to others. All these represent a kind of desire for open access, but you needed the internet to really go forward. But when the internet, when BOAI was proclaimed, OA was mistaken as a tool actually to fight against that rising price of journals. And instead of discussing the purpose of the open access, people got totally mesmerized by the issues of how to find the right business plan for the whole thing. And that, of course, allowed immediately the commercial publishers to move in. At first, those publishers, with very few exceptions, I'm talking about 1999, 2000, were against open access. But in 2002, at Biomed Central, which had just been set up after a repository system by Harold Varmus had not worked the way he had hoped, the system owned by Vitek Trash started exploring the possibility of what we call now article processing charge. So the article processing charge was invented in one remote corner of the commercial world to try and see perhaps there are business opportunities, even in open access. And that's the beginning of the disaster that starts there. So we have something which has disappeared before. Oh yeah, and then after you have the open choice at Springer, which essentially carries the open access APC solution in a very flexible way, because the open choice is really the prototype of what we call now hybrid journals. You know that at least regarding open hybrid journals, the resistance has been very strong and some progress has been done there. So, as research funding agencies began to pay for APCs, they also saw the advantage of OA for impact. Now that had two opposite consequences. On the side of the funding agencies, they got involved inside with open access issues. They did not much before. That was not their problem. But at the same time, for the publishers, the commercial publishers, they suddenly saw the possibility that after all, open access could look like a new source of revenue, a new revenue stream. I still remember Dirk Hank from Springer laughing all the way to the bank, telling how at a banquet, how he had discovered that very fact. I never forgot it. 10 years later, the problems are still dominated by commercial and economic arguments. And the Finch report illustrates clearly the new dilemma. The journals have to be protected. Optimizing the research process can wait. And I had a citation from the Finch report beneath that to demonstrate it very clearly, but unhappily it appears to be eaten up by my bad technique with slides. So you'll have to trust me that it appears in the Finch report. So in effect, the Finch report has applied the famous Lampedusa method, you know, when the high bourgeoisie sees that the economic system is threatened and might change deeply, and they say, oh, well, maybe we have a solution. If we change everything so that in the end nothing changes, let's go for it, you know. And that is exactly what the Finch report did. It justified with the OA gold OA, which was quickly assimilated to gold. As soon as you started talking about gold after 2015, it was only APC gold. But the Finch report had essentially allowed for that transition to APC gold. So here is where the sense of betrayal came. We've been working on that for 10, 12 years. Where are we at? Lampedusa. We have nothing changes because in the end, everything has changed our way. Some forms of open access are not acceptable. Some forms of open access must be resisted, and we've got to go towards the good forms of open access. So this is where we need redress, and I think that the Diamond open access version of open access is the reason it exists. It's a way to think of open access in a wider societal, institutional, power concern manner. So we go to a return to the imperative of access, which had been lost in the business plan, and we return to a concern for the process of scientific research itself so that it can maintain its integrity. Any of you that follow the blog called Retraction Watch must be having a lot of fun correlating what I just said with this. Björn Brems in Germany made a very amusing study showing that the more the impact factor of a journal was high, the higher it was, the higher the probability that there would be retractions in that journal. So, you know, this is somewhat amusing, as you can see. So let's move forward now, because I don't have much time, and I think that time is important. I've been told that. I thought I had an hour when I came here, but I found otherwise. So let's recap a bit what we've learned. The journals are the fundamental element of the new market which characterizes the way of financing a great deal of scientific publishing all over the world, but particularly in the North Atlantic. And therefore, journals are part of the problem. We have to go forward thinking of what do we do with journals? And that's a complicated, very difficult issue. Again, with Pierre and others, we've had long discussions on that, and there are no easy answers. Three options can present themselves, in a sense, to go forward. One, you could create diamond journals that are as prestigious as possible, presumably to compete against the existing commercial journals. You could create diamond journals that exclusively seek quality and try to ignore silly forms of competition, such as citation chasing. And you can also work toward changing journals again, in fact, perhaps moving back to an earlier version of what a journal was before 1950, this time in conjunction with platforms and what has been called in the OA world, the green world, that is the world of the repository, deposits, and the world of la referencia in Latin America, if you want. The first option, to my mind, is very questionable. It will lead to the fact that the new journals will reinforce the dominant game, which has been designed, once again, according to the Lampedusa rule. Watching some of the charity journals that are going around is going to be very interesting in this regard. Let me blunt and very explicit. What's going to happen to e-life in the end? Okay, what's going to happen to it? Let's watch it. Maybe they'll win, but I'm dubious. The second option is the one that a number of public platforms follow, and it is a very important development. I think Redalyc, in a sense, is doing a good deal of that. It publishes journals, and it tries to make them work without worrying about the citation chasing and all this. But how well do they succeed in improving the process of knowledge production in our institutions? Is it a nice alternative that people can point to and say, it helps, it works, it's come our way and all that, but does it really? Meanwhile, people are chasing their citations to get their promotions, their grants, and the rest of it. So the third option to me is the most promising, and that's what I'm going to start offering as a trail. It allows thinking about changing journals, but it allows to do that by thinking about a journal that now sits on a platform. And therefore, we have to do some deep thinking about the relationship of journals and platforms. Inside platforms, journals have to obey to certain rules. They also can do certain things. They are allowed to experiment in certain ways, and so on. That's where the platform becomes extremely, extremely fundamental. And that means immediately that all the public platforms that are playing with journals, Redalyc, Érudit in Quebec and many others, Open Edition in France and so on, they can join, they can form a thing. And I'll make myself the echo of what Pierre was saying this morning. A diamond OA coalition on a world scale is an important and urgent task to develop, very urgent. Bad examples have been shown to demonstrate that platforms are indeed very powerful. If Kathleen Scherer were here, she could tell you our discussions about that. She'll be here tomorrow, so you can ask her. She's right. Platforms have shown how dangerous they can be. Think of Facebook, think of Twitter, think of Elon Musk with Twitter, among other things. But the very power that is exemplified by those bad examples is something that we must not forget. We can also design platforms that can do good things. After all, a knife can cut a steak or kill a person, right? We're not going to ban knives. We're going to use them correctly. Platforms have to be deeply studied too. It's another research field that has to be really pushed, and it has to be thought about with the idea precisely of having journals changed into something different from being a mere merchandise that chases citations. And that means that these platforms can help actually even shape research communities. It's part of the Notify project of CORE that Kathleen Scherer heads with the help of Arcadia. It's a way to create new forms of scientific communities by well-designed platforms. So, this observation means that platforms can start doing things that maybe they don't think about and which perhaps are difficult for some. Share journals, share articles, develop together powerful standards, design journal functions which are much more in line with what you can do in the digital world than the present system actually does. In passing, you may also have been noting how slow the commercial publishers have been in innovating, despite all their call that they need the profits to innovate. What do they do with their innovation? Travel to the Caribbean for a vacation? Is that what they do? So there are many ways to improve journals. They don't have to own what they aggregate. They could, therefore, the articles could move from journal to journal with different audiences in mind. They could record successive versions of the same article so as to have a record of versions rather than the famous version of record that is presently the ownership principle of the platform. They could, through open commons, bring the context, what the philosophers called the context of discovery, much closer to the context of justification. That too would be a very important and interesting development, which would correct what print brought to the scientific world. And they can, of course, contribute to growing communities, as I said a little bit ahead of my time 5 minutes ago. Platforms also allow to revisit publishing functions instead of looking at publishers who don't have to exist, or libraries, maybe they don't have to exist either. Maybe they are now mixed institutions that do a bit of both through the publishing functions. Functions can be distributed across the existing actors so that you can see also that there is a great deal of flexibility in looking at things that way. That's what we tried to do at the European Commission with the expert group on the future of scientific communication and publishing, but the commercial publishers essentially vetoed it. The notion of inside-out library that Lorcan Dempsey has promulgated fits well with platforms, because if each library collects the local production so as to certify and to make available the local production, then the networking that has to happen behind will automatically take the form of some platform, but they have to know how to do it. You have to help them on that. So in all of these possibilities, you see that now the publishing process is very tightly integrated with local research communities. The development of research programs is completely under the control of researchers. There are no financial barriers for readers or authors. The local and planetary scales or reach are reconciled. That's very important, because in our system right now, the local problems are marginalized. Think of how long it took to have some beginning of a solution for Ebola. Why? Because in the north, no one had Ebola, so who cares? Competition, when present in this system, will be based on quality, not prestige. In conclusion, Diamond Publishing, as far as I'm concerned, is about realigning scientific publishing with scientific research while taking advantage, at last, of the full digital context. It is also about creating a fair playing field where the local, the global, and the universal can coexist harmoniously. Muchas gracias.